Thank you so much for everybody joining us for the monthly IIEA webinar series. If you want to find out more about our webinar series, please do go to our website, iraneconomics.org/webinars. We have a few more webinars lined up, I think until March at least, and we hope to see you at those events. But without further ado, let me just pass on to Professor Hassan Hakimian, who will be chairing the session this afternoon.
Thank you, Kamiar. Hello and welcome to everyone from around the world. This is a very international gathering. In fact, it's an international panel as well. It's my honor and pleasure to chair this distinguished panel of speakers tonight, on a very important and pertinent topic relating to Iran's social policy. I know that as a participant, whenever I join a webinar, I'm more interested in hearing the speakers. So I'm not going to give you a long introduction, but let me say in my capacity as the chair and also a former president of the IIEA, the association was set up in 2010. It's a private, non-profit and non-political association of scholars, all of whom are interested in the study of economic issues relating to Iran in the broadest sense of the term. This is why we have been covering a wide range of topics. In fact, tonight is the fourth webinar in the series that started back in August. These webinars are held on the first Wednesday of each month, and they have now become a sort of highlight, a monthly highlight for interchange ideas and having discussions and presentation of latest research on the economy of Iran. The main purpose of the IIEA when it was set up was to promote high standard economic scholarship and research on Iran's economy and to connect the wider network of scholars, no matter where they are from around the world. And I think in that respect, we have been successful. We have the occasion of a book launch tonight on the same subject as the panel, Social Policy in Iran. This book is edited by Dr. Pooya Alaedini, who is from the University of Tehran. And I will be asking him to introduce the book as its editor. This book is being published under a series that I myself edit for Routledge, the so-called Political Economy of Middle East and North Africa. That in itself was launched back in 2003, and we have attested a number of pertinent volumes. Again, a wide range of Middle Eastern economies, including quite a few volumes on Iran. I think this would be our third volume on Iran. The order for the speakers is that after a very short introduction to each speaker, they will present for about 15 minutes. And following Dr. Pooya Alaedini's short introduction of the book, we will have the pleasure of listening to a presentation by Dr. Behruz Hadi Zonuz, who will speak on employment. That will be followed by Dr. Daud Suri, who will speak on poverty. And the last speaker would be again Dr. Pooya Alaedini, who will talk about housing. These topics have been selected from the book chapters. As you know, a book typically includes a wide range of topics, has several chapters, and we can only be selective in what we present. The idea is, of course, to present these topics and these chapters as tasters so that you're encouraged to get the book, read the book, and also use it in your teaching, research, and as a source of reference. Last but not least, we will have as a discussant Dr. Mahmoud Meskoub, who will reflect on the book and discuss some of the themes that our speakers will address. There is an opportunity for discussion and questions and answers. I encourage everybody who wishes to use this opportunity to either raise hands when the time comes after the speeches. We will have hopefully about 45 minutes or so for discussion. Either raise hands or type in your question in the chat area. If it's directed at any particular speaker, please say so, specify, or leave it to us to ask the speakers to address. I take this opportunity to apologize in advance. I know from previous experiences, and given the level of interest and the number of participants, which is also extremely encouraging tonight, like other sessions, it is almost impossible to cover all questions. So we have to be selective, and you have my apologies just in case, because of time limitations, we cannot cover absolutely everything. I promise we will do our best. Okay, let me ask Dr. Pooya Alaedini to say a few words about the book as the editor. Let me, by way of introduction, before each speaker speaks, say that Pooya Alaedini is an associate professor in the Department of Development and Social Policy at the University of Tehran's Faculty of Social Sciences. His areas of interest are urban and regional studies, social policy, and industrial and employment development. He has had previously a co-edited book, a volume on industrial trade, employment policies in Iran towards a new agenda, that was published in 2018. I won't mention all his publications, but just go on to say that he has a PhD in urban planning and policy development from Rutgers University in the US, as well as a graduate degree in economics and engineering. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. Alaedini to enlighten us about his book, which is actually scheduled to be released this month. I think the official release date is end of November 2021. Over to you, Dr. Pooya.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Would like to thank the organizers of this event very much, and also all my colleagues on this panel. This book, as Dr. Hakimian mentioned, will be out on November 30th this month. Social Policy in Iran, Main Components and Institutions. It has 8 chapters, an introductory, relatively long introductory chapter, then a relatively long chapter on the development of social welfare institutions. The 3rd chapter is on Iran's health policy and healthcare system by Dr. Hassan Zadeh. A chapter on education policy, Reza Omidi, my colleague at the University of Tehran, and me. Then chapter 5 is on pension funds in Iran by Hessamli Kupur and Narges Akbarpur Roshan. The last 3 chapters are being presented here. They are on housing, employment, and poverty. And the focus of the book is on mainly on the post-revolutionary period, and through the in-depth investigations that it carries out, various chapters carry out, they also implicitly look into the prevalent and opposing arguments that, for example, highlight social achievements of social programs above all else, those that label all or most government policies neoliberal and disparage them, and those that say the government policy was fine in the earlier period and then it became neoliberal. The chapters generally show a lack of an overarching strategy for social policy, a lack of connection to development policies, and too many disparate institutions and formulate initiatives that have not been realized. So with that, I am done. Oh, one thing, some misunderstanding, Dr. Hakimian. Dr. Suhri somehow has been under the impression that he was supposed to present in Persian. and somehow he had not prepared, and it's probably my fault not explaining that and assuming that he would know. Is there any possibility he can present in Persian?
Is there a choice? Can he be persuaded to? I take that he has a PhD from Virginia Tech. So is it too much to ask him to present in English because it is an international audience? Dr. Suri, is that possible or?
Yes, actually, but I haven't speak English for more than 15 years, so I'm not easy with that actually.
Look, we are not perfect either. Why don't you try? Come on, you can be persuaded.
Okay, if you can. Accept my apologies first for my language. Okay, I'm fine.
Please don't worry. Your slides are in Farsi. It's not a problem at all. So you can still use your slides.
We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
No problem.
Thank you very much. The floor is. Let me do a short introduction, very short introduction, and then I'll hand over to you. So Dr. Daud Suri is an economic policy advisor. He's based in Tehran and is a former faculty member of the Sharif University of Technology, where he taught economics for quite some time. And he received his doctorate from the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University in the US, as I mentioned. So over to you. We are eager to listen to your presentation.
You mean I should start my presentation? I thought Zonuz should first start it.
Oh, you are right. I think on the list I indicated that. My apologies. Yes, my apologies. You're right. I got distracted by the discussion about the language. You're absolutely right. With apologies, Dr. Zonuz, you're actually on the list as discussed before. So if you would like to prepare to share your screen, and meanwhile I'll do the short introduction for you. So Dr. Behruz Hadi Zonuz is a retired member of the economics faculty of Allame Tabatabai University in Tehran. There he taught a range of courses like macroeconomics, industrial economics, and urban and regional economics. He served as economic advisor to various organizations in Iran, like recently the Management and Planning Organization for the preparation of the 6th National Development Plan. He has extensive publications in Persian journals and books, which includes a major report on Iran's industrial development policy experience that was prepared for the parliament. And he has co-authored a monograph on industrial clusters in Tehran, amongst others. He has a PhD in economics from Allame Tabatabai University. And with that introduction, Dr. Zonuz, let me pass on to you for your presentation. Our speakers have 15 minutes, and I will remind you when the time approaches 15 minutes. I'm sure it will not be necessary because everybody's going to watch the clock, I'm sure. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me in this meeting. The title of my paper is Employment Challenges in Contemporary Iran. And let me see if I can. Okay. First, I should say that Iran's labor market challenges and the government's employment policies are analyzed in this paper. An earlier population boom, the disappointing growth record, and the increasing adoption of labor-saving technologies have led to persistently high unemployment and low labor force participation rates. Government policies, that's to say, expanding access to higher education, lowering the retirement age and implementing active labor market policies have remained less than successful in addressing these woes. Because of promotion of population growth, we have witnessed a rapid population growth in the first decade of the revolution. And since then, with a time lag, 20 years time lags, we had these new population have emerged in the labor market in the as 15 to 64 years old population, as you see the red line here. The performance of the market is very contradictory. Actually, if we have the view for last 16 years, we can see that the performance of the economy and performance of the labor market doesn't go with each other. They contradict. In the first period, I mean the years 2005, 2012, GDP growth was 4.3%. The second period, it was much less and at 1.3%. But astonishingly, surprisingly, unemployment rate has decreased in the second period. And in the meantime, in the second period, some 2 million jobs have been created. Also in the second period, the labor participation ratio has increased. These are showing the contradictions in the statistics and data. The data is collected on the sampling basis. Maybe there are sampling errors in the data or other forces, factors which we don't know exactly. Unemployment rate, despite the fact that we have witnessed a very rapid fluctuation due to sanctions, has been almost the same in the long run, as you see from this figure. But long-term unemployment has been considerable in the among the unemployed. Actually, mostly more than 38% to 40% of the unemployed are experiencing more than 1 year unemployment. At the same time, long-term labor participation rate have decreased in the Iranian economy, as you can see from this figure. And surprisingly, with the unemployment among men and women who have higher education has been higher than average rate of employment in the country. This shows that there is a mismatch between the education and labor market demand. Sorry. The other feature of the labor market in Iran is that the size of informal economy as well as informal employment is very high in the country. Two estimates shows that in the long run, average share of informal employment have been more than 42%. of the labor force. As far as the labor market regulation is concerned, I have compared the situation in Iran with Turkey, Malaysia, and South Korea. This comparison shows that, except in one aspect, the situation in Iran is worse than the other countries. Actually, only Iran has the lowest premium remuneration for overnight work, holidays, and overtime work, but has highest number of paid annual leave days. And in Iran, minimum maternity leave is very high, 270 days. Only in Iran, the approval of a third party is legally required, dismissal of redundant workers. As you see, as far as regulation is concerned, labor market in Iran is very restricted and regulated. As far as labor market efficiency is concerned, I have compared the situation in Iran with South Korea. As you see from this table, in all aspects, rank of Iran in this efficiency indicators is less than Korea, South Korea, which is an industrialized economy. Usually in the literature, we read that the main reason of long-term unemployment in economy is related to minimum wage regulation plus trade unions' power. But I have tried to show that these two factors have negligible effect on the rigidities, wage rigidities in Iran. That's why the reason behind the large unemployment and underemployment in Iran cannot be attributed to the minimum wages and trade unions' power. Trade unions were briefly empowered after the revolution, but they were then turned into Islamic labor councils, in which workers and managers have been represented under the close watch of the government. As you see, this is the minimum wage on 1395 custom prices in Iran. It fluctuates. When there is a sanction, it goes down. In both periods of sanctions, real wage has gone down. There are, as far as the labor market policies are concerned, there are three policies which can be distinguished. One is the expansion of higher education and skills. This has led to the delaying participation of young generation in the labor market. But it has led to a sort of labor market mismatch, because the opportunities in the universities for education, higher educations, are not based on the demand side of the economy. Early retirement is another policy which has been followed by the government and also the parliament, indicating that when you have more people who are retired, you will have more jobs for new generation. But the experience shows that since the pension funds payment to the retired labor force is very low, it goes under the poverty line, then the retired labor comes back again to the market. Then it has no effect, real pure effect on the labor market supply side. In the last 20 years, there has been very significant financial resources which have been allocated to create new jobs in the market. But it has negative effect on the budget of the government and banking system, but it doesn't have a sort of distinguishable effect on the labor market and unemployment. As concluding remarks, I should say that Iran's labor market woes cannot be mitigated without sustained high rates of economic growth. This has remained elusive since the mid-20s through the 4th, 5th, and 6th National Development Plans. Whereas these plans have called for an annual economic growth rate of 8% between 2005 and 2019, Iran's non-oil GDP, employment, and labor productivity expanded by only 2.6%, 1.1%, and 1.5% respectively. The long-term low employment to output elasticity estimated for the period 1996-2016 to be around 36% is another source of worry. It is largely derived from the government's misguided policy of providing significant subsidies to energy and capital financing. Against the backdrop of international sanctions that have been intensified since 2018, Iran's GDP at the end of 2019-2020 is expected to be about 10% smaller than it was 2 years ago. These problems cannot be solved without addressing the chronic tensions in Iran's international relations and its macroeconomic instability, as well as extensive shortcomings with regards to its business environment and financial system. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zonuz. This was on my clock exactly 15 minutes, almost to the second. If we could have the same degree of precision by all panelists, I think my job tonight would be completely redundant. I could go home. Thank you so much for that punctual and very engaging and interesting presentation. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. Suri, whom I've already introduced, to take over. You also have 15 minutes, so please go ahead. And you are muted, so you will need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Still muted.
So much for having me here, and I'm also appreciative of talking about is and house is a point in Iranian history to me, mine for Iran. Fortunately, all of my slides are graphs, and so if they are in Persian, there is no any problem for audience, and they can get it. My presentation is based on data, household expenditure data, which are publicly available on SCI, Statistical Center of Iran, and anybody can download them and use them. So let me go first to my first slide, and I want to show that the population change in Iran, although it was in favor of poverty and welfare during the past 2 decades, the Iranian economy couldn't use this population change. And if you look at these 2 graphs, we can see that the average head of households in Iran, both urban and rural area, during this period, after 2005 till 2 years ago, the average age of head of households are increasing. That means the households getting older. Beside that, the average size of households are decreasing during this period, both in rural and in urban areas. Almost 1 person of a household size, it was subtracted 1 person from household size during this period. The average age of family, I mean, the sum of the total age of all family members divided by the family size is also increasing. And we can see that, as we expected, dependency ratio was decreasing during this period. That means that in terms of the population, in terms of the household size, we have a good situation to expect more welfare and more income for households. We have households with less children. We have households with more members in work age, actually. And we expect, if we could have a growing economy, we should saw household welfare was increasing. But if we look at the average yearly income per breadwinner for household, we can see that this expectation wasn't happen actually. And we can see that after 2010, the average yearly income of breadwinners are decreasing. They couldn't participate in economy, or even the economy was not growing, was not creating wealth for them. So we can see that the average yearly expenditure per adult equivalent of household has the same trend as we saw in their average yearly incomes. That means that although we had a good windows of opportunity in terms of the population change, we couldn't see that opportunity in households' welfare. The households couldn't use that opportunity. Less population, working population, less children in households, But we can see that all of this doesn't have anything for their welfare, because economy couldn't help them, couldn't work with them to generate more income and expenditure. In these two graphs, we can see the earning distribution of urban and rural during these years from 2005 onwards. And we can see that these boxes shows the distribution of incomes. The line between the boxes is the median, and the start and end of the boxes shows the first and the third quartile of income. The red line, just I draw that to show, to help audience to compare these boxes. And we can see that during the time, we are still in the, not just in the, we are very, the distribution of income are very lower than the 2005, and we can see that the height of boxes are slower. That shows that during these times, the income distribution was very dense and very better than the beginning of the period. But as we can see, the income, the mean of income, the median of incomes are decreasing, so that that income distribution improvement is actually the poverty distribution equality between peoples. Because in this situation, when the family doesn't have any growth, the improvement in income distribution is nothing that improvement in poverty. The same things happen to the expenditures. In these two graphs, we can see that the expenditure have the same trend as incomes of households. I calculated the poverty line for Iran for both urban and rural, and these numbers shows the trend of the poverty line. I don't want to argue about the level of poverty line, because there is no consensus about it, and there's no any agreement about the level of poverty line. But what I stress on that is the trend of poverty line, which is increasing. And this is not very weird, because we do have during this time a high inflation and low growth rates. As poverty line increases, we can see that here about the headcount ratio, the ratio of poverty, poor people divided by all peoples. We can see that the poverty ratio or headcount ratio is increasing both in rural and urban areas. As maybe it's very strange that urban areas are more poorer than rural areas, because there is, I think it's goes back to the definition of rural and urban areas in formal statistics. I also calculated the multidimensional poverty line, and this multidimensional poverty, I used some other dimensions of poverty, like education, like assets, like income and housing. I defined some measures to calculate the poverty in these dimensions, and using the index of Alker and Foster, I calculated the poverty line. Here we can see the poverty line for Iran during the exactly same period, and we can see other trend. The trend of poverty line is different with the trend of poverty line in terms of income and expenditures. Here we do have some other dimensions like education, like assets, like housing. And here we can see that the poverty line, at least after 2010, are both in poverty, in both in rural and urban areas, are decreasing, which is different with what we saw in poverty line in terms of income and expenditure. But if we look at the share of income in multidimensional poverty, we can see that the share of income has increasing during all period except the last few years. What I wanted to say is that when we look at the poverty line, poverty in terms of income, we see that the Iranian households are more poorer than before. They're getting in poverty continuously because they don't have enough access to income. They don't have enough access to expenditures. But when we look at the multidimensional poverty and bring other aspects of poverty into the game, like education, like assets and housing, we see, no, they are not much poor. Even this index, when we look at the HDI, we can see that Iran is in a good situation. It's not among the most poor nations. What I wanted to say, and what I want to conclude, is that we are poor in income. Our economy, based on oil revenues and public expenditure, can provide education, can provide housing quality, can provide health for people. But when we get to use these opportunities, to use this empowerment of poor, these aspects, economy does not come to help households to generate income. The public aspects of poverty as financed by government, but the private aspect of poverty, where people want to use their money to buy things from the market, they don't have enough money because they don't have job, because they don't have enough income, because the economy, the macro policy of Iran, which shows itself into job market, into the wage levels, doesn't help them to get enough money to get rid of the poverty. When we look at this graph, we can see that there is a relation, negative relation actually, between the poverty rate and economic growth in Iran. But I use 2005 as a reference point. Why I use this time? Everyone knows that in 2005 we had a new government. The government of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad took the power, and after that, after a year or two, we encountered with the sanctions, and we saw that all of those things happens into a household's welfare during this period. The first thing we may thought is that, okay, we can see the poverty increasing because the Iran is under sanctions, or because of the government of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, or after that, Hassan Rouhani or others. Here, I show that the economic growth of Iran after 2005 and before 2005. We can see two different trends. After 2005 is decreasing. Before 2005, at least after the Hashemi government, we can see steady growth in GDP. The same thing happens to the inflation. Before 2005, we have almost decreasing trend in inflation. After that, we have increasing the inflation rate. And all of this happens after 2005, where we had the highest oil income in our history. This decrease in growth rate and increase in inflation happens by when we look at the population pyramid and we compare the population pyramid in 2015 and 1995, compare these two pyramids, we can see that in second period after 2005, we had good situation in terms of the labor force. We had many people between age 20 to 44 than in 1995. That means in second period, we had good opportunity in terms of labor and also in capital. Even after sanctions, we can see that our country had more income in terms of real dollar, than before 2005. That means we had good opportunity in terms of labor and in terms of capital, but we couldn't use them to help households to have good welfare, more welfare, and less poverty. What I think is actually is not just sanctions. I think in this period after 2005, our economy goes to a new phase, and that phase is because 2005 is almost 25 years after the revolution, and we can see that after 2005 we have a change in most people work in ministries, and most people working in all government organizations. They don't have the quality of the people who were educated before revolution. They were get in the job during the revolution or before the revolution. All of those people get retired in 2005 around. And after that, we have new generation as experts in all of our organization. And I think all of this happens because we are in a new situation with new experts in all our organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suri. Appreciate it very much that you switched to English, and in fact, you did very well. So with my thanks, let's now go over, rather go back to Dr. Alaedini for his presentation on housing. And I've already introduced him, so the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes as well.
Okay, hello again, and thank you. Dr. Suri actually went beyond his paper and provided some very interesting insight into why things have changed over the past 15 years. Interesting. So this final presentation is about the housing policies for low-income and vulnerable groups. And housing is quite important for welfare. It addresses residential needs, impacts health, access to services, and also it addresses financial needs, future financial needs. It generates jobs, and it has macroeconomic aspects. But it has potential for speculative activities, and it can be a source of significant inequality. Housing was a major source of dissatisfaction in the 1970s, and probably influenced the events that led to the 1979 revolution. In the post-revolutionary period, there has been a number of initiatives and pieces of legislation, but housing affordability overall in the entire period has declined. Home ownership rate has also declined, while informal settlements, slums, urban slums have expanded. So this chapter actually discusses these policies and which are quite complicated. That's why it's a long chapter, and also looks at the end result. And this is a joint chapter written by myself and Fardin Yazdani. So after the revolution, the new constitution explicitly endorses housing rights for the Iranian population. And as a result, there were several, in the early years of the revolution, several pieces of legislation were adopted that restricted tenure, facilitated takeover of land by the government, and allowed for land allocation supposedly to low-income groups. Also, the government in the following years provided home mortgage loans and also subsidized construction materials, carried out a number of sites and services projects, and also called for the expansion of housing cooperatives. Several organizations were established. One important one is Housing Foundation, which was originally mandated to deal with the housing situation for low-income groups, but it has only, in practice, has only focused on rural areas, rural housing, not really urban housing, except a few cases. In the first decade of the post-revolutionary period, these strategies, although there was no long-term, really a long-term vision for them, but they succeeded in lowering the property prices and decreasing the share of housing in total household expenditures and temporarily restraining speculative property speculation. But they probably also encouraged rural-urban migration, larger families, urban sprawl, and also acted as disincentives for the actual development of the housing sector. The first, second, and third development plans, basically starting in 1989, these are post-revolutionary development plans. We also have 5 or 6 pre-revolutionary development plans. These focused on housing for blue-collar and workers, government employees, provision of infrastructure for sites and services, but they were not, they faced a lot of challenges. Prices continued to expand despite the fact that the government was allocating significant land, and real estate speculation and informal settlements actually proliferated. There were also initiatives for rental housing. There was the government documents really don't distinguish between, of this period, between rental programs and rent-to-own programs. And what was really carried out were really rent-to-own programs, very, very small programs, and they haven't really been repeated, even that. But eventually, the earlier restrictions and also allocations were lifted by the end of the first decade, post-revolutionary decade. And reduction of subsidies and land allocations actually gave rise to rapidly rising prices. These were also exacerbated by the so-called sales of construction rights for higher floor area ratios in urban areas. In Persian, tarakum furushi, or sale of the construction density. These actually created a situation for extensive speculation in urban areas. There were also other things, you know, for example, land grabbing has been a major issue over the past 40 years in Iran, which that's also go hand in hand with the speculative activities. By the end of the third plan, it was clear that there was a need for a comprehensive program. And the fourth plan actually calls for it, for a comprehensive housing plan. And the aim was to streamline housing subsidies under a comprehensive social policy framework, reforming urban planning and land management structure to address the needs of low-income households, overhaul the housing finance system, and decentralized housing initiatives. But the comprehensive housing plan was actually abandoned basically once Mr. Ahmadinejad took over as president. But part of it was leveraged, and what this part of it was provision of land based on 99-year leasehold arrangements, so that the price of land would be excluded or reduced in the final price of housing. This part of it was used by the Ahmadinejad administration to create a mega project. It's called Mayor Housing Plan, or MHP. It was launched in 2007 to construct 1.5 million housing units. Eventually, this was revised upward to 2.3 million housing units. It provided free public land, subsidized finance, and tax exemptions or discounts, and eligible applicants paid sort of 1/3 of the price up front, and then the rest of it in installments. Although many of the units were handed over to customers this was supposed to be a very quick project in just a few years, but it has taken a very long time, 12 years for all this. Of course, the projections were revised upward. So several million were actually, around 2.2 million were handed over were constructed by 2017. And Mayor Housing actually continued through 2019. What were the problems of MHP? So urban planners and housing experts know that when you create basically apartment buildings in vacant lots in the fringes of the cities, or in new towns that are already suffering from infrastructure and social services deficiencies, you create new problems. But this MHP also had a capacity and financing challenges, like government capacity to carry out all these, the program, and also financing challenges, which manifested themselves in budget shortfalls, and then which had inflationary consequences, supposedly affecting low-income groups disproportionately. This meant that the prices rose, and so even low-income groups would probably not be able to access these, and they haven't in the more recent period. Many of the housing units were constructed in remote areas lacking infrastructure. Those located in the new towns, they put additional pressure on the new towns. Many of the units became unaffordable or unattractive because they were in remote areas. A large number of them were not occupied by the owners, but were rented out. Again, suspecting speculative activities here. And some informal settlements, interestingly enough, some informal settlements appeared right next to some of the MHP sites. So MHPs were supposed to address the housing needs of low-income groups, but you have informal settlements appearing right next to them. So there was overall a mismatch between MHP and the requirements and needs of most low-income groups. But to be fair, MHP has had an element of success in securing home ownership for a large number of beneficiaries, and the provision of infrastructure and services in MHP sites have improved over time. After 5-6 years, eventually, they've been given additional services. During the Rouhani administration, originally they said MHP was bad, and this should be replaced by, again, we should go back to CHP, the Comprehensive Housing Plan. The Comprehensive Housing Plan was revised, and it's a long document, but some of its elements creation of a housing fund, making more mortgage finance available to low-income households and slum dwellers, institutionalizing a social housing program, social rental housing program, and also a general rental housing program. Other documents were also drafted in this period, but none of these, the sixth development plan also calls for the same types of things, supports these things, but none of these actually were implemented. The social and low-income housing plans were not implemented. What happened was that eventually in 2019, they sort of went back to the MHP 2, which was called National Housing Action Plan. And which was supposed to construct 400,000 homes by 2022. I don't have the statistics of how much of that were actually realized. But now we have a new government administration, and also which, as soon as it took over the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, passed a new law, a law on a housing production leap, to make a housing leap. And its elements are, it does make reference to CHP, and calls for a creation of a housing fund and targeting low-income groups, and also, again, land allocations based on 99-year leasehold contracts. And also, we've been hearing over the past month that they want to build 1 million housing units every year, but these are not very clear statements. And the program, although they've just asked for new applicants, they've called for new applicants, but really the extent of the program is not very clear. I should mention here that Iran's welfare institution, especially the paragovernmental revolutionary foundations, or bunyads, and also the state welfare organization, they have some very small programs for housing programs for vulnerable groups. Actually, the major one is under the state welfare organization to build homes for families which have disabled members. The other ones really have entered into small contract with the state welfare organization to support the same activities. These are the Alawi Foundation and the Imam Khomeini Relief Foundation. So what are the outcomes? I'm showing a few tables here. For example, the home ownership rate has continued to decrease over the years, despite all these programs. These are extensive programs to provide, actually, the focus is on home ownership. The average share of housing in household expenditure has increased. Households under poverty line in 2 years, I have some numbers here, that has also increased over the years. And rising housing costs and reduced housing affordability has fueled the proliferation of urban informal settlements. For example, the background documents of the sixth development plan give a figure of more than 3 million households, or about 12 million people living in urban informal settlements. That's about a quarter of the housing stock. This is a graph which shows the different indices. Price index says rental price index, consumer price and land price index, construction price index, Tehran land price index, and home price index. The top one is the land price index, and then the one below it is the home price index. These graphs show that the major culprit behind the rise in the other indices follow the inflation. They're about the same as the general rate of inflation in Iran. But the land prices are a major culprit behind the rising home prices, and which shows which shows the need for managing urban land. What I mean by managing the urban land, first of all, releasing land, adequate land, making adequate land available for home construction. The other one is using proper taxation mechanisms to control speculation. Also note that when people see that the home prices rise so fast, everybody wants to invest their savings in property, and that only adds fuel to this trend. This is home ownership for different deciles. Lower deciles have definitely been a lot worse off through the years. They've the rate has decreased significantly. And these are some trends.
Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Alaedini. Can we wrap up?
1 minute. Can I have 1 minute?
Sure. Okay, 1 minute.
Okay. So I go to my concluding remarks. So the focus of government activities has been on home ownership, and no comprehensive housing plans, although they've been formulated, they haven't been adopted. And I've written here why. I can say during question and answer, I can answer that. Little attention has been given to the need for connecting housing and poverty reduction and social welfare programs. There is a need to focus on social, low-income and rental housing. And there is significant room for government action to address failures in the real estate, housing, and mortgage finance market. But this is related to the Iranian political economy. That must also be, its perils must be addressed. Sorry if I took longer than I was supposed to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, that was fine. I hope you don't mind me reminding the time. I think with many speakers on the panel, it's important that we manage time so as to preserve space for interaction with the audience as well. Okay, and we are in a fortunate position to have as a discussant for the panel, Dr. Mahmoud Meskoub, who is currently a senior research fellow at the International Institute of Social Studies, ISS Erasmus University of Rotterdam in Holland. He works with a consortium of EU and African universities and institutions on an EU-funded research project on the narrative of migration. His other research interests are in the areas of economics of population aging, social policy, and universal approach to social provisioning. He has recent publications relating to population aging and social policy in MENA, poverty and employment policies in the same region, and unpaid household work and cash transfers in Iran. So Dr. Meskoub, over to you for the discussion of the issues raised by the panel and also the book, since I know you've been privy to an early draft of the manuscript.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Thank you for introduction and the great presentation by everybody. And thank you for inviting me to read this very interesting, very important book on social policy in Iran. Unfortunately, I don't have any overhead slides for you here. So you are forced just to see me and listen to me for the next 15 minutes. I'm going to read through my notes because they're partly based on presentation today and partly on what I have done in reading the book. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Alaedini and all the other contributors to the book. It is a very important, interesting book and a very timely book because, as all of you know, Iran is going through a lot of minor and major crises, and it matters for the population to see what is going to happen in terms of the policy on social issues. Basically, I mean, the strength of the book is this: at the very start, Dr. Alaedini writes that he does distinguish between social policy, which is a strategic intervention in social life, and not just provision of health and education and poverty reduction, in support of the development of strategy and human development and welfare of population. And this is different from narrow the social protection, which usually kicks in when people fall on hard times. So it's very important that he does distinguish between these two things, and his focus is on social policy, and the authors do, all of them appreciate this difference as they have done their chapters. The book goes over several issues which are crucial for social policy: health, education, old age security, pensions, employment issues, poverty, and housing. Now, what is important about all the chapters is that they have a very creative approach to unpacking the current problems that I mentioned, like in the employment, pension, housing, etc. But my concern is that when it comes to theoretical approach, the economics of the economics and theoretical underpinning of much of the discussion is more focused on the orthodox supply and demand and market-oriented approach. And in my view, here and there, they pay attention to the institutions, legal and regulatory issues of that govern the market. But they have to really pay more attention to these other issues, and not just focus on the orthodox supply and demand, and as if markets will solve all the social and economic problems of Iran. If I come to the specific papers, I'll start with Dr. Alaedini's, because I like to deal with the poverty and employment together, because they are related in terms of the relationship to growth, etc., that they discuss. With regard to Dr. Alaedini, I agree with him about the history, of course, because he has done a great job of tracking all the history of the housing policy in Iran and going through different phases. But I'd like to ask him a question about the relationship between housing and land prices and asset prices, because I think it's more important to link housing and land prices to other assets, as mentioned himself toward the end of his presentation, that the people shift their assets to land and housing, and that greater demand of the side by the people who have more money will increase prices and would price out the poorer section of the population. So it would be good to see the index of land price and house prices in relation to dollar, the black market rate of dollar, and the gold and other assets in the country, because that will give us a much better handle on why there is such a boom and bust in the housing price, in housing costs and land prices. The other issue that I'll have is the share of housing cost in total expenditure, the household expenditure. And in the 2019, it was recorded as 36%. Basically, 36% of household expenditure goes on housing. I think this probably would change dramatically if we go city by city or province by province. And I think in Tehran or other big cities, it would be much higher than 36%, and that would put a lot of pressure on household expenditure. So I would like him to explore that if he doesn't have the figures now, but at a later stage, perhaps he could inform us. There is another issue to do with housing in urban areas in Iran is the price of land. As I understand, land cost, is a very high cost of the housing construction in Iran, especially in the big cities. And that, in my view, calls for an urban land reform, which hasn't been on the agenda, although in your discussion, Dr. Alaedini, you mentioned two different policies on land reform, restrictions. They're trying to reduce land speculation in order to open up more land for different purposes. But I think we need a much more radical land reform, urban land reform, in order to reduce the cost of the housing for everybody practically. And this issue of the land reform is common to a lot of developing countries, because everywhere you look, price of land is an important aspect of the important component of the final cost of housing, and land investment in land is part of the speculative activities of a lot of people, and mainly the more affluent sections of the population. If I come to Dr. Zonuz and Dr. Suris, I'm with Dr. Zonuz on his presentation and great the analysis on the problems of employment in Iran. But I have a couple of questions. One is to do with the unemployment of the educated people. The graph that he showed, in my view, would be better if we have a comparison of the unemployment of the educated with the unemployment of uneducated or lower educated people. Because we know that the labor force participation of the women is low compared with other countries, and also in Iran has gone down dramatically. So it would be good to see the difference between the labor, the unemployment rate of the people with low education and unemployment rate of the higher education, the people with higher education. And the reason that I focus on these two groups is that we don't know whether it is to the level of education that people are unemployed, or because they can afford to be unemployed, because they come from a higher income families. And that's an important distinction in terms of why people are unemployed. It is not just to do with the labor market, but perhaps they have a higher reservation wage because they come from a high income families. In reading his article also, I came across this paragraph on labor force participation and its impact on productivity. I think he mentions that in the paper that if labor force participation goes up, then we could have a higher level of productivity. And I could understand this link in his discussion, because if labor force participation goes up, supply of labor goes up, and if demand for labor doesn't rise as fast as supply, labor will be cheaper, and therefore less incentive to substitute capital for labor, which is usually behind labor productivity in countries like Iran. I'll come back to the discussion that he put towards the conclusion of the paper about the link between growth and employment in a minute. Dr. Suris' paper on poverty is very interesting and is very useful, and draws our attention to the underlying inequality in Iran. And this is very valuable for any social policy discussion. I have a couple of questions to ask here. That the paper focuses on the concept of poverty more from an absolute poverty point of view rather than relative poverty, I think. But and this concept of, but the other point about poverty is that the concept of absolute poverty, usually in the discussion of poverty in Iran or even other countries, is makes poverty into a static the problem, that if you give people a certain amount of money, they will not become poor anymore. Basically, it's a once and for all solution to the question of poverty. Whereas poverty is dynamic, and poor people are not fixed number of people. Although there, in general, there is intergenerational poverty. There are a lot of poor people who grow up in poor families and continue to be poor. But it's important that we deal with poverty in relative, absolute and relative terms, and also over time to discuss how people become vulnerable to poverty. And this understanding of vulnerability of poverty gives us a handle to manage poverty by reducing it continuously, because in a dynamic country, all the time people may fall into poverty, and there we need to intervene all the time and not just rely on handouts just to the poor people who exist, who are poor today. In the discussion on the importance of growth in the Dr. Suri's the paper, as well as in the Dr. Zonuz the paper for increasing employment and reducing poverty, I think we need to pay attention to gross employment nexus, elasticity of employment with respect to growth in different sectors. Although Dr. Zonuz mentioned in his conclusion that elasticity of employment to output in Iran is about 36%, which is below 1, and therefore the increase in output has not led to a proportionate increase in employment. I think Dr. Zonuz's figure are for the total output rather than sectoral. It is important to pay attention to the sectoral elasticity of employment, because it is a sectoral elasticity which focuses our attention on which sector to pick up to see whether the poor have the integrability in the sense that they can get jobs in the areas, in the sectors that are growing. And from my work on the sector gross employment nexus with the ILO, in the 1990s and early 2000s, sectoral elasticities, agriculture, services, and industry, in most the MENA countries was below unity. Therefore, growth on its own will not lead to more jobs. And that's important to bear in mind. And this is not bad, by the way, because it means that productivity is increasing and reinvestment surplus would hopefully be higher and would lead to higher growth and higher employment later. So we need to discuss such elasticities before we can assert that growth and trickle down on their own can deal with the problem of absolute or relative poverty. Because Dr. Suri's main focus in the discussion of how to reduce poverty is to do with the growth and the trickle down approach to reduction of poverty. The other issue with growth here is this, that, as you know, we have a COP conference in Glasgow, and all of you have heard about the sustainable growth, etc. We have to factor that in somehow. And sustainable growth and poverty reduction have to come under one roof. We cannot rely on high growth to reduce poverty. So we need distributional policies to achieve low sustainable growth and high human development. And here we have to make choices. Distribution is part of this agenda, and we cannot do without it. And this distributional the issue has to be an important part of the whole discussion on social policy in Iran. Now, Hassan, do I have a couple of minutes?
Your time ended half a minute ago.
Okay, okay, just the extra minute, I'll be done.
Actually, you've raised enough questions. I suggest if you can stop here, because we have too many questions to answer. We should really allow
Okay.
the audience
May I
also.
just make one sentence? I'm done. My last sentence would be that the social policy in Iran or anywhere else have to focus on supporting family budget and have a strategic objective of any social policy, and not just directly by throwing money at it, but through a package of health, education, housing support, and minimum wage, and also the subsidized goods, etc. So just handing people money is not going to be the answer with regard to supporting family budget. Thank you very much, Hassan.
Well, thank you, and thank you to our panelists for covering really a fantastic array of issues and topics. Some very, very meaty points have been raised. I noticed that Dr. Beskov, you have raised a large number of questions. With your permission, I would really like to try and bring in the audience. I would leave it to the panelists to address some of the questions you have directed at them later on, because otherwise we'll end up talking amongst ourselves, and some of these topics can take up a lot of time. Kamiar, I can see, I mean, we've had a good number of questions. There are also hands up. We have half an hour left. I would like, as I've said at the beginning, to try and maximize time for interaction with our audience. I can regroup some of the questions and direct them at the specific panelists. Kamiar, if that is okay with you, I can do that.
Yeah, I'm happy to promote people as you see fit.
Okay, let me group, because some of the questions tie into particular themes. Let me do my best in the interest of time and focus to try and group some of these questions together and direct them at a specific panelist to address them. And then, time permitting, I would ask you to allow those who want to articulate their own question later on. With your permission, there are a number of questions addressed to Dr. Zonuz on unemployment. The first question is actually an interesting one. From your perspective, what are some of the causes of the gender gap regarding unemployment rate? You did show that unemployment rate for females in Iran is higher. And then the questioner goes on to ask, are there any culturally embedded factors, i.e. majority of women not willing to work or men insisting on being the mere breadwinners? So this is a question about your view on causes of the gender disparity in unemployment rate. There's another question which relates to the labor law. I agree with Dr. Zonuz that labor law in Iran is very restrictive and perhaps more suited to advanced economies with enhanced welfare policies. Have there been any attempts at reforming labor laws to improve labor market flexibilities? So if I can invite Dr. Zonuz maybe to address those two questions briefly as possible, and then I'd like to bring in other panelists with some of the questions that have been addressed to them. Please, over to you.
Thank you. I will try to just give some brief answers to your questions. The causes of gender gap in Iran are manifold. It's not only cultural, it's mainly legal. Actually, government employment policy in public sector is restricted against women. This is one reason. And the other cause is that women should work with the permission of their husband. This is another restriction. And also tax exemption goes only to men, not to women, you see. And that's why the women participation in labor is very limited, even compared to many countries. This is as far as the gender gap is concerned. What about labor law? Labor law, as you know, since the beginning of the revolution, there was a 12 years delay to approve a new labor law after the revolution. And then after approval of the labor law, gradually the power of trade unions decreased. Then labor law was amended many times, indirectly, not directly, by giving a new bill to the parliament. But indirectly, they exempted many people from labor law. And that's why there is a contradiction between legal constitute of the labor law and its implementation. Now, many workers are not getting benefit from labor law. Sometimes the amendments to labor law has been against the initiatives of the government. For example, when you give 270 days leave for maternity, it is against the employment of the females. Actually, most of the entrepreneurs will not accept such a big gift to the women who brings child. However, there are certain laws which exempt the small-scale industries from labor law. These are the answers which I can just give to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Let me also combine two questions raised with reference to Dr. Suri's presentation relating to poverty or aspects and put them over to you. One questioner asked, what are the safety net entities that exist in Iran to support population at risk? I think Dr. Meskub also mentioned safety nets, but this has been largely absent from our discussion. So in relation to poverty mitigation schemes, what safety net schemes do we have, if you can reflect on that? And another question for Dr. Suri is, I think this can be clarified pretty quickly. In most graphs that you showed, the year 2010, which is 1389 in Iranian calendar, the observation was an outlier. And the questioner is wondering whether you have any ideas what happened in 2010. I think most of us know, but we want to hear it from you. Over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, first, the second question, as you know, 2010 was the first year after the subsidy targeting program of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and we should consider that as an outlier because it was a year after that program, and anyone wants to show himself as poor to get the subsidy. And as I show in our graphs, I think the most safety net and the most programs that government after the revolution done for poverty alleviation was to invest in education, to invest in housing, to invest in health of people, and to invest in roads, electricity, and these type of things. And as we can see that these measures doesn't help people much to get rid of the poverty in terms of their individual power of purchasing the stuff. Except that investments, we do have many subsidy that they are universal actually, and they are targeted to the all peoples, especially on basic commodities like bread, rice, and these sort of things. And also there are some organizations, those who are expert in targeting the poor people and help them directly by paying the cash transfer actually. If I need to.
No, that's fine. I think that's fine. We can leave it there if you're happy. Thank you very much. There have been quite a few questions relating to housing. So let me again try and group them together, Pooya, if you don't mind. One question is about whether there are any special housing assistance programs targeted at youth in Iran. You know, when you discussed MEHR program, you touched this in brief, but if you can expand on that in particular. The other one is relates to the land prices, and the questioner is asking, why is Tehran land price index underperforming compared to the general land price? I assume this is the overall country, if I understand it correctly. And we had one other question regarding whether there are any data on homelessness and rough sleeping in Iran. I mean, this is a widespread international problem, particularly in large metropolitan cities, as we know. It's sadly a very common sight in many big cities that we encounter on a daily basis almost, at least pre-pandemic and pre the lockdown era. But are there any data on homelessness and rough sleeping in Iran, preferably by major cities and or in rural areas? So those three questions to you, Pooya.
Yes, thank you. I got only two questions. One was the comparison between land prices in Tehran and other cities and the homelessness. The third one?
Youth one, the first one.
Youth, yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yes, there are some programs. There has been some programs for youth in the past. For example, the rent-to-own project was basically carried out for the youth. And right now, the MEHR housing had some special provisions for the youth, and the program that the Raisi administration is formulating is also focusing on the youth. Now, the question is whether or not a large number of the youth can actually benefit from these programs. Do they have an adequate assets to even enter these types of programs? The rent-to-own was a very, very small program, and very few people really benefited from it. The difference between land price index in Tehran and the other cities, the thing is that Tehran was moving up very, very quickly before, and other probably urban areas were left behind. What we've seen in recent years is that all the urban areas are catching up and moving. The growth of their prices has been faster than Tehran. It doesn't mean that Tehran is underperforming. It just means that their other urban areas are performing quite well. And about homelessness, there are only anecdotal information about homelessness in Tehran or in other cities. We know that it's homelessness is expanding. Yes, we know, but no specific data. I have not come across it. Should I answer the other questions raised by Dr. Mescoub, or leave those?
Just wait for a minute. I will come.
You will come to that. Okay.
At the end, I will come back to the panelists for final thoughts and addressing some of the questions that Dr. Mescoub raised. I want to actually turn the table over to Dr. Mescoub. He asked a rather large number of questions as a discussant, but there are also some questions for him. So he's not reprieved. I'm going to direct one or two questions from the audience to him. One of them is about pensions. And I know that Dr. Mescoub has worked on pension scheme in Iran. And although this is covered in the book, it has been absent from our discussion tonight. Maybe you take this opportunity to reflect on the pension scheme, their adequacies or inadequacies or challenges in the Iranian context briefly. Of course, our intention is to get everybody who has more questions interested in the book and to want to read the chapters in the book. So we cannot pretend that we cover all questions, nor do we think it is possible to do so in the limited time we have. There is also another question for Dr. Meskoub, and that is about inequality of access to education, that education schemes, the questioner agrees with you that the education schemes and opportunities seem to be favoring the well-off. And don't you think this is a recipe for further greater inequality, social inequality? So maybe if you can reflect on pensions and inequality of educational access.
Thanks, Hassan. In fact, on pensions, the chapter on pension, I read through it very carefully, and it's a very interesting chapter in the book. Those of you who are interested in pension policies in Iran, I really advise to have a look at this chapter, which provides a very good comprehensive history of the pensions in Iran from early 20th century. With regard to adequacy of pensions in Iran, on the face of it, pensions in Iran are very adequate because the replacement rate, which is the ratio of pension to the salary in Iran, is very high, almost 100%. And this, at the beginning of retirement, is very good. But inflation erodes the pensions in Iran very fast because pensions in Iran are not index linked by law. They go up gradually over time if government raises them according to its procedures or protests by pensioners. So the pensions are the important part of the retirement income of people who are old, who are not working. But as you know, in the past 10 years, 15 years, when the inflation rate have been very high, pensioners have suffered a lot. The other the issue on the pensions in Iran is to do with the problems of pension funds. Pension funds in Iran are supposed to pay from the revenue of the funds that they have invested. This is the concept of funds. Otherwise, it will be pay as you go, like a taxation. The pension in the UK, the state pension is pay as you go, whereas pensions that university staff or civil servants in the UK have is funded because investment of the pension funds pays for the income of the pensioners. But in Iran, there is a confusion here because funds which were established at the beginning to invest and use the revenue of the fund to pay for the income of the pensioners, retirement income, because of the inadequacy of investment, the investment do not generate enough income, and therefore they have become as pay as go, which means that the current contributors have to pay for the current retirees. And this has created a crisis effectively right across the board, and government has to intervene every year to make sure that pensioners get their pension. And this is really one of the key issues of the pension crisis in Iran. And the state owes a lot of money to the pension funds, and pension funds have to rely on the transfer of money from the state in order to manage their liabilities. So this is really the one of perhaps, along with unemployment, is the second most important problem for the country. And the other issue about pensions, the funds in Iran, is the fact that the governance of them are not very clear. Basically, because the state has such a large stake in the social security, civil service, and military etc. pensions, the interference on the appointments, on the management, upon everything is politicized. And of course, you don't need me to remind you that Ahmadinejad appointed one of his acolytes to the head of the pension funds in Iran, and he distributed money out of people's pocket. Or also, you know about the pension fund of the Ministry of Education, that people robbed the pension fund from a huge amount of money, and they are now, I think some of them are waiting for the prison for the trial. I don't know what has happened to that. So the pension fund, this is something which we should hear a lot more about in the years to come, and I hope that it will be resolved sooner rather than later. On the question of education, in general, Iran, like any other country, the higher education is much more in there is an equality in terms of access to higher education by higher income people. But I'm not sure about the question saying that because the people have higher education, it will create instead of capabilities, it creates megalomania, and people will get ahead of themselves, so to speak, and all that. I think it's good to have higher education. People with more education usually do better in any walk of life. At personal level, I have no problem with it, but at macro level, there has to be a match between education and employment prospect and the need for a skilled labor. And that cannot be solved at micro level by opening up various the colleges, etc. That is the macro decision, and it's something else that we can come back to later. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. We've had, as you can imagine, we've had a lot of questions, very lively questions, and on a very wide range of topics, and I'm trying my best to actually give them some structure. There are two more philosophical questions, and I'm going to address these to Dr. Pooya as the editor of this book. One of them is by one of his own colleagues, Dr. Ali Saidi. As a sociologist, he's challenging us economists. As you know, social policy is also a sociological and political issue, especially in Iran. Don't you think we should look at this issue from this angle as well? If so, what approach can be taken to poverty and housing? That's one question. So it's an invitation for us economists to look beyond our immediate disciplinary borders. As you know, in IIEA, in International Iran Economic Association, we define interest in research in Iran in a broad sense. We have had panels which have involved interdisciplinary experts. So that's one. The other one is very general. The questioner says, I'm wondering if we should see the social policy in Iran over the last 4 decades as a random or haphazard plan with a clear theme, such as improving equality, or should we just see it as a universal plan with some flaws? In other words, does social policy in Iran over the last 4 decades have a main thrust, or is it something made up as we go along? Dr. Pooya, don't feel you have to go to great length, but yes, any overall or broad reflections on the need to engage disciplines, and also this one, the nature of social policy.
I make it quick. Thanks to my colleague, Dr. Saidi, for raising the first issue, the fact that social policy has significant political and social dimensions that one should look into. Certainly the way I'm going to answer this is actually related to the second question, which is it a universal or some haphazard attempt at social policy? It's political because the political at least one of the political aspects is that the people were never have not been asked to pay taxes to receive services. There is no debate on the relationship between what the Iranian public is supposed to come up with, and then what types of services they're supposed to receive. And this has a social aspect and a political aspect. Once the new system was established in Iran, probably the system itself also did not like this relationship to be established, the way its politics actually formed and its structure was shaped. These two are not related. What should people give and what should they get? There is absolutely no debate, and that's why it's not universal. It may be similar to some other countries, but it's unique in that sense, in the same sense, the relationship between what people are supposed to give and what they're supposed to receive. So I would say that it is haphazard because this relationship was never established, and Iran's politics does not allow for the establishment of this specific relationship and the form and the debates and discourses that are required to actually determine this. That was the best way I could answer this at this
Well, okay,
point.
I think that's a clever way of answering both questions together. So thank you very much. We have one hand up, and that of Dr. Salehi Esfahani. He hasn't typed in his question, so I can't speak on his behalf. Kamyar, would you like to give him the microphone so he can pose his question?
Absolutely. Here he comes.
Hey, thank you. Do you have my voice?
We do.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, congratulations on such a valuable panel. In particular, I think IIEA should be congratulated for being able to attract talent from inside Iran, where information that they have, the institutional details are really rich. And I personally benefited a lot from this panel because of that one aspect. However, having said that, I have a comment on my good friend, Dr. Suri's calculations of poverty lines, on poverty rates. First, let me preface this quick intervention by saying that poverty rates these days have become highly political. Americans who go to negotiations with JCPOA are trying to gauge how bad the situation in Iran is. When they see 40, 50% poverty rates, and neighboring country, Turkey has 10, 12%, and so on, they begin to think of Iran as like India or even China. And that's really bad. I think we need to create some kind of understanding, common understanding of what poverty lines are and what poverty rates should be. Now, I quite agree with Dr. Suri that poverty lines are arbitrary. Anyone can put anything they like. And there's no problem with that. I can say most of Iranians are poor. I can say 50% are poor. But what I cannot do is to change the poverty line from year to year and disturb the pattern. The change over time in poverty is a scientific concept. And what economists usually do is they calculate a poverty line for 1 year and keep it constant in real terms, and then apply that to different distributions from each year. And this is not what my impression is what Dr. Suri has done. He has calculated poverty rates, poverty lines every year. And the numbers he's come up with have serious problems. For one thing, if you look at the PPP rates that IMF and the World Bank use, these are rates that equalize the purchasing power of, say, a million tuman in Iran with so many dollars in the US. That if you apply those PPP lines that are on the web, you can download it from the WDI website. You find out, for example, one of the highest rates is for urban upper poverty line in 2015. I'm working with the table 8.1, 8.2 in the book because I didn't quite capture the full slide when Dr. Suri was presenting it. Now, that is $87 per person per day in urban areas. Now, how can you bound a society to pay anyone with less than $87 per person per day to tax the others and pay this person? That will not happen. If you look at it from another perspective, not the PPP rate, but if you look at the inflation rate, that's implied. Sorry?
We are really under time pressure. If you can, I think you've asked.
Okay, one sentence, just one sentence.
Thank you.
The poverty lines rise at twice the rate of inflation. And that makes no sense to me. If the inflation rate is so way off, that should be debated inside Iran. But you can't raise the poverty line twice the inflation rate and then calculate the poverty rates that are rising over time. Whereas in fact, we know until the 2016, 2017, poverty rates were declining. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And as much as I would love us having more time to deal with these questions, obviously we are under time constraint, and it's quite late in Iran, especially. I'm going to invite our panelists to offer their final thoughts. You can be selective. You can address any specific points that have been raised by Dr. Mescoop in his discussion section, or deal with any other issues that crossed your mind in relation to what has been said. And if you can keep your final contribution to 2 to 3 minutes, these issues are not going to go away, you can be sure. We are going to be here for a long time discussing these, and of course, the publication of the book would be a major contribution to these ongoing debates. So I'm going to ask Dr. Suri, would you like to address Jawad's specific point and or any other final points briefly, please?
Yes, thank you. First, let me show you some numbers about the poverty elasticity related to the growth, where Dr. Mescoop asked about it. The poverty elasticity of growth in Iran is about 2%. This is a number we have estimated some years ago, and it's negative, and it's more than 20%. That shows that the poverty is more sensitive to the growth. Regarding to Jawad's comments, as I said, poverty line is arbitrary number. There are many questions that must be answered to calculate the poverty line, and any researcher answer those questions by its own way. So we don't have any official poverty line here in Iran, and anybody can calculate the poverty line. The poverty line I estimated is not raised more than 2 times of inflation rate. No, it's more or less raised by inflation rate, but I didn't use that concept, and I estimated the same by same methodology every year. I estimated the poverty line. So the rate of increase in poverty line is more or less equal to the inflation rate, but I don't want to talk about the level. The trend is obvious, and the results I talked about that was sensitive to the trend, not the level of poverty line. Regarding to the PPP rate and comparing with the other countries, actually PPP conceptually is a great idea and is valid, but practically in Iran, I don't believe it, because first of all, we don't have any exchange rate market here. We don't know what is the exchange rate. Even in the price level, even in the measuring the inflation rate, there are many interventions by government in inflation rate. We don't know what is actually the inflation rate, because many commodities are subsidized by the government. So in calculating PPP and comparing with the other countries, there are a lot of reservations that we should consider. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me invite Dr. Zonuz to offer his final reflections and/or response to a specific question posed to him by Dr. Maskoub.
Yes. First of all, I thank Dr. Maskoub for his comments, and I want to answer some of his questions. He's quite right to emphasize on the sectoral elasticity of employment. That's good. But in the meantime, it should be noted that in Iran, the elasticity of employment is very low because of overvaluation of real, then the negative persistence of negative real interest rates on bank loans, and subsidy which goes, high subsidies which goes to energy prices. All of these are working at the direction of labor saving technologies. Actually, this is the main reason that the elasticity of labor elasticity, sectoral elasticity of labor in industrial sector is very low. As far as the rate of unemployment among those who have higher education, I should say that Dr. Maskoub is again right in emphasizing that if we compare the unemployment between those who are educated and those who are not educated, we will give a better understanding to the public. But in the meantime, if the rate of unemployment for educated people are higher than the average rate of unemployment for total workforce, then we can conclude that those who are uneducated have less unemployment rates. This is obvious, you see. As far as I want to emphasize the last question. He asked me, what's the relationship between labor participation and productivity? I should say that maybe the shortcoming is from me. I wanted to emphasize that if the obstacles of the participation of educated women in the workforce are removed, and they come to they contribute to the workforce. In the meantime, total productivity of labor will go up. But I accept that my language was vague, actually, in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much for keeping comments to the point and punctual. Dr. Maskoub, how about you? Without posing more questions, if you have final reflections.
I can assure I won't pose any questions, and I'm sorry that I'm between the dinner of our colleagues in Iran and the ending of this this discussion, but just give me a couple of minutes. I just want to go back to points I made. In conclusion, I want to bring home to our colleagues in Iran, also elsewhere, that the dominant narrative of economists and sociologists in Iran is that market will answer economic and social problems in Iran, and along with it, freedom of Iranians would depend on the market. I want to emphasize that this is not going to be the case necessarily, by the way. First of all, I just want to quote Stiglitz today, who said that how confident can we be that markets are efficient, stable, fair, and competitive on their own. So there is a need for intervention in the market in order to make it work better. But we know the situation in Iran, and I don't want to go into it, but we should not put all our eggs in the basket of the market. The other point, final point I want to make is that the social policy, as I said before, we are better off if we focus on vulnerability to poverty and not just focus on measurement of poverty and basically poverty industry, which has grown everywhere, by the way. But we need to deal with the most important cost and impact issues with regard to the component of household expenditure, housing, health, education, and nutrition stroke diet. So a handle on these issues is crucial for the vulnerability to poverty. And security of income of a household is based both on employment and transfers, both in cash and kind. So we cannot just have cash transfer and forget about the other aspects of the people's welfare. So we need to have both cash and in-kind transfers, which brings up the question of distribution of income and distribution of wealth in Iran. So supporting family budget is the most important strategic objective of social policy. And if we put that on the agenda and we use all the legal means and also all the social pressures to achieve distributions in Iran, we are going to improve people's life and reduce inequality and improve welfare for not only this generation and then also the next generation. Thank you, Hassan.
Thank you very much. Okay, the final word goes to the book's editor and master of the project. This took you how many years? 2 or 3 years perhaps to put together from the moment?
A couple of, yes, 2 years.
Yes,
2 years.
which is very common in this kind of project, but I'm sure looking back, reflecting back, you consider this a well worth project. So over
Definitely.
to you for final thoughts, please.
Thank you. Actually, I asked Dr. Mescoub to co-edit this book, but he did not accept that and did not contribute a chapter either, I should say.
I'm very sorry because of the pressure on my time at the time. Sorry.
Yeah.
Inshallah, next book.
Next book, inshallah. I wanted to mention the fact that there is a need. I agree with Dr. Mescoub that we can think of some more radical things. For example, he mentioned a radical urban land reform. Definitely we need that because a major source of wealth inequality in Iran is actually land property of ownership. And it's huge. If somebody has just 1,000 square meters of land in Tehran, they can, buy in London, they can buy a very nice place. They can do whatever, it's a really huge amount of money. And it's sort of ridiculous that we do not, the government does not tackle this head on. And Dr. Zonuz just mentioned, we have in certain periods of time, we have overvaluation of the Iranian currency, which means that the dollar and gold have not been as promising as land and real estate. And it's also confusing. Of course, people, for whatever reason, may diversify their portfolios to holding land, dollar and gold, all of these things for whatever reason. But land constitutes a major asset, and I should definitely look into the relationship. That's a worthwhile activity. I wanted to. My last point is that also related to the question that were raised by Dr. Saidi, that there is and again mentioned by Dr. Mescoub, the government has been reluctant to carry out, to develop community-based programs. And community-based programs are needed to address the housing issues, to address informal settlement, or slum upgrading issues, but the government has been reluctant to do any of that. Instead, it has relied on direct cash transfer, for example, or very, very minimal empowerment programs, very, very minimal. So there is a huge need and there is a huge scope for those types of activities that are community-based, that give power to the communities, and also develops lower level governmental and non-governmental institutions. I think with that, I wrap up my few points.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm really indebted to this panel for offering a very, very lively, thought-provoking, stimulating, and informative set of issues relating to the social policy theme and the book. We could have gone on for a long time, but of course, all good things have to come to an end, and this is no exception. So I want to encourage everyone to check IIEA's web pages. Kamyar in a moment will direct us at the next activity lined up for next month. And I also want to take this privilege I have as the chair to encourage you to look up our series, the Routledge Political Economy of Middle East and North Africa series, in which this latest publication appears. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, this would be at least the third volume on Iran-related topics. The first one was by Ewa Leila Pesaran on the struggle for economic independence in Iran. The second one was edited by myself and by Parveen Alizadeh on Iran and the global economy. And now we have a new one on social policy. With that, good night, good evening for those in Iran, and good early afternoon for those in the Eastern United States. Thank you so much to everyone, but don't go. Kamyar is going to wrap up by telling us about the next month.
No, just one final word to just thank you all from behalf of the IIEA, both Hassan for chairing it so excellently and for our panelists for really thought-provoking presentations, and to you participants in the audience for asking so many questions. I noticed there are about 10 questions that haven't been answered and many, many more in the chat. So I hope you engage with the speakers directly. And I am for sure very excited to read the book Social Policy in Iran, Main Components and Institutions, all 8 chapters. Hope to see you next month. We will have our very own Jawad Saleh Esfani chairing a keynote given by Essi Masumi on new approaches to intergenerational mobility. And this is happening on Wednesday, 8th of December, same time as today. So hope to see you all, and thank you so much for tuning in.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
خیلی ممنون دکتر مسکوب.
خیلی
تشکر
عالی بود.
دکتر
مرسی.
حکیمیان.
ممنون.
کامیار جان خیلی ممنونم.
تشکر از شما. مرسی.
خدا.
شب بخیر.
شب بخیر.
صبح بخیر. امریکا.